Hello everyone, welcome to another Inkarnate live stream. My name is Mati. Today we're going to be creating dungeons with the Fantasy Battlemaps style. And today we're going to be focusing a lot on process, dungeon shapes, encounters, etc. So we're going to be kind of helping you out with kind of understanding how to put together your dungeons, what to put in them, themes, and all that kind of stuff. Because dungeons can seem kind of like quite a tackle with all the different chambers and things like that that are in them. So first, let's go ahead and maybe like define what a dungeon is. If you want to follow along, by the way, you can go ahead and clone the link, the map link in the chat right there so you can follow along. And first, let's just talk about kind of like defining what a dungeon necessarily is. Hello everybody, welcome, glad that you're here, by the way, awesome. So let's go ahead and talk about what exactly like a dungeon is, okay? And a lot of people might think, well, a dungeon is really quite simple. It's just, maybe the prison that holds prisoners underneath a castle, as you might expect a dungeon to be. But in Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop dungeons are a little bit more complex than that, more than just a prison to hold prisoners. A dungeon is something that has, either one large cavern or multiple kind of rooms or chambers, and it's isolated from each other. And it can be indoors or outdoors. It doesn't really matter whether it's indoors or outdoors. It doesn't have to necessarily be a subterranean. It doesn't have to be underground. It can be a number of different things. So let's go over a couple examples of what people might expect a dungeon to be. A simple dungeon with multiple caverns here, or it can be a sewer system where there's multiple pipes that you follow through, and there's multiple chambers, antechambers, rooms, and things like that to kind of maneuver around, where there's going to be obstacles such as encounters, traps, puzzles, locked doors. All those things are going to be like incorporated into a dungeon. Hey, the musical rogue. Awesome, so glad that you are here. It can also be outdoors as well as indoors. Like you can make it a whole village where there's a series of kind of interiors of buildings. It doesn't necessarily have to be subterranean. So a lot of different things that you can do with a dungeon. It can be just a series of rooms outdoors in like an open ruin. This could be considered a dungeon. Or it could be a large cathedral with multiple chambers, multiple rooms, and all the different types of rooms inside of like a temple, a cathedral, a castle, anything like that. All of those things could be considered a dungeon. There's generally multiple types of chambers in the dungeons that are isolated from each other, held together by passages. All those things might be considered a dungeon. So now when you're thinking about, well, there's going to be a lot of different chambers in the dungeon you're creating, how is it that I decide the kind of shapes and what to put inside the dungeon and all that stuff? That's going to come with having a process and knowing where to start, starting with the entrance, and then kind of moving forward with all the different types of chambers and trying to figure out what kind of dungeon that you want. So let's talk a little bit about process to kind of help us out here. And process is going to help you with making a map quicker, easier, better. It's going to look nicer. And the first thing you have to do is establish a setting. Now, every single one of these example maps right here has a setting. You've got a cavern, you've got a sewer, you've got a village, you've got ruins, and you've got like this cathedral with the multiple rooms. So you decide the setting. Is it going to be a mining shaft where dwarves have, kind of left the mine shaft? It's abandoned, been taken over by somebody else. Is it a sewer system underneath the starting village or a later village in your campaign? Is it going to be maybe a thieves' fort where there's multiple rooms inside this fort or fortress that you're traveling through? So you need to decide the setting or theme first. And once you've kind of decided that, then you can start putting together some shapes that you want to make and decide what each room or chamber is for and where to put encounters, traps, etc., etc. So let's decide our setting. And I'm going to stick with kind of your generic, what you would expect from a dungeon: subterranean, multiple chambers, because that seems to be the most popular, or what a lot of people kind of visualize a dungeon to be. So let's go ahead and go with that kind of theme. And then we want to set our scale, and scale is going to be absolutely important because you're going to want to know like how wide a tunnel or chamber is so that players can walk around nicely on the grid when you're playing, because you don't want to accidentally discover, oh, well, I made this awesome map, but the grid does not conform to it, making it difficult to play on. So the first thing you'll do, of course, is set scale after you've decided that setting. And I'm going to stick with a 40 by 30 rows. Okay, and each one of those square grids is going to represent 5 square feet, and so it's going to be 200 feet by 150 feet. Now, that may not seem very big, but when you are going through very thin 5-foot wide passages and maybe 20-foot caverns, 20 square feet caverns or whatever, that's actually a lot. That's a lot because you're dealing with all the different kind of chambers and passages. So in an open battle map, that might not be very big, 200 feet, but in a dungeon, that's going to be quite a bit. Okay, so 5 square feet, that's going to be for each little cell that we have there. And now that I have that, it'll be easier to decide the scale of things. I know not to make a crate that's going to be 4 of those cells. Otherwise, that's going to be a 20-foot, or a 10 by 10 or a 10 square foot crate. That's going to be huge. Okay, so the grid is going to help to kind of determine the scale of the stamps and the distance and how to actually design all of the chambers, because we're going to use that grid as a guide to say, oh, I won't accidentally make a chamber too small or too massive. So now that we've set the scale, we can kind of move on to the next thing. So let's also talk about the various types of dungeon shapes that exist, because if you already have an idea of the types of dungeon shapes that you can work with, it kind of helps you to make each chamber within the dungeon a bit easier. So let's go through the various types of dungeon shapes or organization. This is really types of organization that you can really use. Okay, and you don't have to use these. These are just the ones that I use for myself. So the first one is going to be a centralized. It just means there's one centralized chamber which all other chambers are attached to. So that might work great for maybe a boss battle, or maybe a puzzle room where the main chamber is where the puzzle is, and then these smaller chambers outside or to the adjacent to the larger main centralized chamber is maybe items that you need to pick up to, complete the puzzle, or maybe it's where bad guys come and try to stop you from solving the puzzle, whatever it might be. So that centralized organization is really nice for things like that. There's also isolated, which means you might have chambers that are completely isolated from each other. And that may seem odd at first. Well, how do I travel from chamber to chamber? Well, that could be maybe you have a teleportation circle that is on one of the islands or isolated islands, and then you teleport from one room to the other. So isolated is great if you want to show teleportation. You want people to move from place to place without having to travel by foot. So great use there. There's obviously a radial, which is somewhat similar to centralized. There's a centralized chamber, but really the chambers that go off of it radiate outward. Okay? And so that radial is great for all kinds of things. Maybe you have to go into each one of those sections. You're trying to escape traps, trying to fight monsters, whatever it might be. Maybe there's some chests in one. So this radial form is another kind of dungeon shape that you can use. And there's also the grid, which is pretty basic. The grid just means it's going to adhere to whatever that grid is. You can use the mask tool or use the wall shapes to go around the grid so that it makes sure it all fits together. And it's nice to actually have some chambers in your dungeon that doesn't just look like a natural cavern, but has some straight lines to it. And that kind of breaks up those jagged lines and adds some straight lines, or vice versa. So having a mix between jagged or more natural caverns while having carved out human-made caverns as well. And that way it looks kind of nice. The next is a kind of cluster formation, where you have multiple chambers that are kind of clustered together, and it might be connected by maybe one main passage or multiple passages. So it's kind of this nice cluster kind of feel. You'll be using that a lot. At least I have in a lot of my dungeons. The last one is going to be a linear kind of progression where your players start at one end and then go down to the other. This is great if you want to do kind of an Indiana Jones style kind of boulder chasing after your players. Maybe you're trying to build this anticipation before they get to the chamber at the end. And so having this long passage without other chambers kind of builds up this anticipation, making it kind of scary, right? So linear is a great one to add as well. I don't recommend that every single one of your dungeons follows maybe one of these dungeon shapes or forms of organization, but uses several of them. You don't have to use all of them, but maybe use 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of these in your dungeon, okay? So that way the shapes are unique and interesting. And then also we want this reusability where if you want, you can resize certain sections of the dungeon to use for other dungeons. Because why make 20 different dungeons for your campaign when you can make one large, variegated, lots of different chambers and passages, and then just all you have to do is just resize that section. So in other words, you want to create a large dungeon that's reusable through resizing and just changing some things. So that'll be really important as well. A lot of DMs don't have time to make 12 dungeons. Just make one and resize. Now that we've gone through that dungeon shapes, I'm going to go ahead and turn that grid back on. And we're going to go check out our process here. We've gone through shapes. Let's talk about making the shapes. And we're going to start by using kind of the mask tool, okay? And the mask tool is great. That mask tool is going to use the add mode of the mask tool. And I would recommend that you make your BG. Let's go over to your brush options. Go to color, choose black, and then click the fill BG button, and it will fill the entire BG with the black color. And that's going to be useful later because we're going to use a black grid, and I want to hide the grid on the outside of the dungeon so that way only the grid shows up inside of the dungeon. Because some people have asked, well, how is it that I only make certain areas of my dungeon have a grid while others don't, like the outside of the dungeon? And it's just using the same dark black color for the exterior of the dungeon, and then that way the grid will only show up on the interior of the dungeon, and we'll show that. So let's go ahead and use the mask tool to create the shape. And remember, there are multiple ways you can use the grid to do it, and you can use the edgy brush to kind of create your more natural shape. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the FG layer to kind of show you the overall dungeon shapes that we're kind of putting together here. Just allow it one moment to load. Might be a little slow. And you'll see that I've got some mask effects here, and I've created a series of tunnels and chambers, and I'll show you where to start, how I put all this together, the mask effects that I used, so that way you can see, well, wait a minute, how did he make that, okay? So whenever you're starting with your dungeon, you want to start with the entrance first, okay? So I'm going to go right over to my dungeon, my DM only. When you're working on a dungeon, it's always nice to have maybe a little group that's labeled for DM only. And what that is a series of notes and labels for you yourself to see. So that way you remember where traps are, so that you know where locked gates are, where you know where certain things are, where encounters are going to take place. So having a special group that's dedicated specifically for that will be helpful for you as a DM. So that way you don't have to write these notes down. It's all right here on Inkarnate. It's right there for you, okay? All right, let's go ahead and turn on the background as well, and I'll show you what I mean by the grid. Okay, so allow the background to kind of turn on, and then I'll change the grid to black. Right now it's set to white, so you can see the grid on the entire map. But if I go to that grid and then switch the color over to black, and then I'm just going to drop the opacity a little bit because I don't want it to be that accentuated. Let's just maybe bring it down a little bit. And if I zoom in carefully, you'll notice that I can see the grid inside of the dungeon, but I can't see it outside of the dungeon. So remember, black BG, and then turn your grid to black, and that way you won't have any of your grid showing outside of that dungeon. So I'm going to open up the DM only, and I'll start with kind of our labels first, so you kind of know where everything is. And there are a couple important rooms, a couple of important chambers that you need to figure out first before you start putting everything together. And that is, you got to figure out where your entrances are and your exits are. Your entrance is where you start, your exits is where you exit. And I would totally recommend multiple exits. Players like it when they have more options. If you limit their options, that the whole combat experience of going through a dungeon can get boring and kind of lag. So giving your players multiple options on where they can get into the dungeon, where they can exit the dungeon, gives them a sense of freedom and makes the dungeon more interesting. Next, you want to have a couple important rooms, like a puzzle chamber maybe, which is specific to maybe a puzzle that maybe opens up important parts of the dungeon for your players to get into. Perhaps it's certain areas that they want access to or whatever. So a puzzle chamber is one chamber that you're definitely going to want to consider. The other is a boss chamber where you're going to fight your main boss. If it doesn't matter what it is, it could be maybe an evil alchemist or a necromancer or maybe the queen empress spider, whatever it might be. So a boss chamber. And then that last kind of important room is going to be that loot chamber. Okay. And the loot chamber is important because after you fought that boss battle, you need a sense of reward for your players. Okay. After they've gone through all these challenges, there needs to be something that's going to be challenging, that's going to have a reward for the challenges. So having that loot chamber is going to be really important. So you can see where everything is. That entrance is going to be right here. We're going to have a puzzle chamber right here. And this kind of helps you to already figure out what you're going to put in those rooms. Obviously, there's going to be certain things like puzzles and other things that are going to be in that puzzle chamber. That boss chamber is obviously going to have maybe some interesting environment that your players can interact with, maybe some height, maybe some rocks they can jump off of, some things they can hide behind of. It's a larger open chamber, so throw in an environment that your players can interact with. And then again, that last chamber is that loot chamber. Obviously, it's going to be clear what you're going to put in there. Gold, coins, chests, boxes, crates, whatever might have the goodies, okay? So that important loot chamber. And make sure that it's not far from your boss chamber. So after they've defeated the boss, they kind of go into the loot chamber, right? So you're starting with, of course, your entrance. It goes to the most important, all the most important rooms, the puzzle room, the boss chamber, and then goes into the exit. And there's obviously some other exits here. Remember, your players want options. Don't leave them with just one option. They're going to like that, okay? All right, let's keep going. So now let's also kind of go over a little bit about mask effects and walls, okay? So if you don't have the time and you just want to leave it like this, you just use the mask effects. And I'll go ahead and turn the mask effects off so you can see the big difference, okay? I'm not using any stamps to make any of these chambers. Instead, I'm using mask effects. So I'll go to advanced settings. If I turn off the mask effects, you'll see immediately what happens. The dungeon turns flat. So using mask effects to accentuate height, to accentuate walls, to make lighting and those kind of things, that mask effect is going to be very, very helpful. So if you're curious what those mask effects are, clone and edit this map and you'll see that they're there. Okay, so if I turn the mask effects back on, you go into the shovel on the left side, click enable mask effects. And again, you'll kind of see that I've added some inner and outer shadows using light and dark, white and black shadows to create contrast, allowing depth. Now, if you don't like the idea of using the mask effects and you would prefer to use stamps, you can totally do that. Just know that the more complex your dungeon is, the more you're going to have to frame every single room with a wall or some kind of cavern stamp. So we haven't implemented the room tool yet, but once we get the room tool, you won't have to worry about ever doing wall Tetris again. But for the time being, I would recommend just using mask effects so that way you don't have to use more stamps, because you're going to go through a lot of stamps to kind of ring or frame all of these rooms. So just use mask effects for the time being until we have the room tool, or if you have the time, you got a strong machine, throw down all those walls, okay? And I'll show you what that would look like. Yes, I'm so excited about the room tool. I can't even tell you how excited I am about it. So now I want to first, just real quick, go over each kind of room and what the dungeon shape that I kind of used. So let's go into DM only, and I'll turn off those labels for now. We don't really need them. So I'll turn that off for now. Okay, let's go ahead into our shapes right here. So as at the entrance, we have our first dungeon shape. We have a linear. So everything that I've kind of gotten in that red dotted path is those are going to be what are considered linear type of passages or chambers. So I've made 3 of them. There's a little bit more than that, but they're linear. They're just going from one end to the other. Okay, and that's as simple as it is. And you can put those wherever you want, but start with your entrance first. Okay, so we have linear there. Let's go ahead and turn off our linear, and I'll show you centralized as well. And I've used the puzzle chamber to be the centralized. You see there's a centralized chamber in the center here, and then there are these venting, branching chambers that go away from it. I'm going to put each puzzle inside of that. Now, if you look carefully, notice that I'm following that grid. Remember, you see how these chambers are 3 by 3, so there's 6 of those squares. So every one of those chambers has room. It's following to the grid. Even the natural chambers have enough space for players to move around. So even when you're using that edgy brush, make sure that the edgy brush at least stays within the grid shape, because you would hate to have your player be half outside of the dungeon and half inside of the dungeon. So make sure that you use that grid as a guide. Turn it on when you're using your mask effects. And remember, these mask effects, these dungeons are made with the add mode of the mask tool, because your BG is the black. And so go ahead and use those mask tools to kind of make those shapes. So again, that puzzle is where the centralized one is. We'll also show where our clustered as well. We have some clusters as well. And these ones are kind of the easiest out of all the dungeons to kind of, or dungeon shapes to make, because there's no symmetry to it. There's no kind of pattern to it. It's just kind of random clusters. And that's kind of easier to kind of produce, okay? And remember, I mentioned to throw in those, use that grid shape as well, because you notice you have these nice straight lines on top of that natural chamber look, in which I used the edgy brush to kind of create these natural cavern shapes. Okay, let's keep going. The last one is just going to be your isolated, which remember are those islands that don't have any kind of visual passage to them. Just make sure that you have have access to get to that. I'm going to end up putting the summoning circle where all those arrows kind of converge right there. And so we're going to put a summoning circle there, and each element within the puzzles, each one of those 3 chambers within the puzzle chamber is going to have maybe something special. And so the summoning circle will take you to 3 different locations, depending on maybe an item that you have or a spell that you cast. So these are going to be those isolated segments of your dungeon, which there are no clear visible passage. And we'll go ahead and delete that. So you've seen that I've gone through all the various types of chambers or various types of organizational forms of organizations that you can use. So again, we're going to start, you start with the entrance. I've used that linear passage. That entrance leads into the main centralized section. Notice that it's even kind of centralized on the map as well. Okay. And then I've created 2 possible ways. There's a second chamber that kind of goes into the boss chamber here. And there's obviously another way to get into the boss chamber here. And then it goes into this loot chamber. And then you can put more loot, or you can put whatever you want within these extra chambers. That's really up to you. And then even though you've defeated the boss, sometimes you might want to take a different route that takes you to a way that gets out. So those multiple exits are going to be really helpful. All right, now let's go to the next step in the process. First, let me kind of show walls. I just want to show you what your walls would look like. So now I've kind of added some walls here. Hey, first time chatter, Fianchi04. Hey, glad that you're here. Oh yes, we stream every single Wednesday, or dang close to it every Wednesday. So definitely come and join us 3 p.m. PST. So I'm really glad that you're here, by the way. Awesome. All right, so as you can see, I've added in the walls, and I've used 2 types of stamps to do that. That first one is I've used these cavern stamps to represent the more natural shapes. So these cavern stamps right here. And it's just like framing. It's just like when you brick up a well. You've made the shapes with the add mode of the mask tool, and then you just frame them with stamps. Now for the more straighter, more human-made chambers, I've used a brick wall, and that way it looks like it's, instead of having a natural feel to it, it has a human-made feel to it. Okay, so that's if you want to add walls, and I'm going to put walls on it because I kind of like the walls. I think they look nice, but you don't have to add the walls if you don't want to. Entirely up to you. Let's go ahead and kind of move on to the next step. The next step is access. Once you've kind of put together all the chambers, once you've put in all the passages together and kind of put it all together, and you would definitely just make all the various chambers and then connect them with passages, is we want to talk about how is it that you decide what to put inside of every single one of these chambers? Because there's a lot going on here. On a regular battle map where it's just a house with just one room or a hut, it's kind of easy. You've got one section to detail and it's kind of easy. But when you have a dungeon that has multiple chambers and passages, you can kind of get lost in the sauce a bit about, well, what am I going to put in this chamber? What am I going to put in here? What am I going to put in there? Where do I start? Well, access is really the way to do it. And access is everything, okay? And access is more than just the entrance and the exit. It's traps, because traps limit your access. It's going to be encounters, because monsters, beasties, bad guys are going to block your passage. They're blocking access. Is it going to be chests that have keys inside of it that give you access? So if you start with the concept of access first, then it becomes easier by just starting populating the dungeon with all the various classifications of access. So let's go with the first one, which is going to be where your exits and your entrances are. And I've just simply used a ship staircase, and I've changed it to the luminosity blend mode, so it'll just pick up whatever's underneath it. And one trick that you can do that's really interesting is that you can take those exits and you can open it up and select all those stairs, and then you can select the hamburger menu and select flatten to the FG layer. And what that will do is that the shadows, notice that there are some shadows right here. You see how the shadows from the mask effects now affects the stamp. Let me undo it real quick and you can see it again. We'll let this undo. Notice that the shadows from the mask effects do not affect the stamp, right? It has zero effect. But if you want the shadows from your walls and from your various cavern walls, shapes and everything like that, flatten it to the BG, and it will also allow you to paint over it, okay? Because once you flatten something to an FG or BG layer, it's baked it into that paintable layer, FG or BG layer. Because the dungeon is the FG layer, we'll go ahead and flatten it to the FG layer, and it looks nice because it now interacts with the shadows. It looks a little bit more interesting, and it's going to save your machine some resources, because the more objects you have on your map, the more resources it's going to take, the more lag that it might create. So flattening is great, and because you're going to be using this map later, and maybe for other dungeons and things, all you need to do is, you don't have to select everything and delete it. All you have to do is just paint over it again. Okay, so it's really, really helpful to use flattening, especially if you want things to interact with the shadows. Just know that the danger is, there's a caveat, is that make sure that that's exactly where you want that stamp to be before you flatten it, because if you want to edit it, you can't. It's been baked in. So make sure it's exactly where you want it first, and then flatten it. Notice here that I've taken some stairs here and also flattened it, making sure that it interacts. Some nice tricks that you can do before flattening is luminosity blend mode, so it picks so that the material or the texture is picked up beneath the stamp before you flatten. And you can also drop the opacity a little bit so some of the texture shows through it. Then flatten it. That way your stairs look like they're a little bit more natural. They kind of fit in with the ground beneath them. Okay? And adding in lots of stairs can give the dungeon a sense of depth and height. So you notice that there are stairs all over the place where these kind of flat walls are, kind of giving it a nice kind of feeling to it, giving it some depth, okay? Now, the next step is you want to add some locked gates, okay? Throwing in locked gates gives that sense of, oh, hey, this restricts access. So I've used these prison gates right here, and I put them in some strategic locations so that way access to certain chambers are limited. For instance, that centralized puzzle chamber leads right to the boss chamber. Well, there's so much more to explore, so I don't want players to immediately go right into the boss chamber, so I've added a gate there, and it also creates this sense of tension and kind of feeling to it of like, oh, I can see inside the boss chamber, but I can't see far enough to where the boss is, what it might be, or how to fight. So it kind of creates this kind of anxiety for your players, makes it a little bit scarier, so it's kind of fun to do it that way. But I kind of want my players to first go through the summoning circles and then go to those isolated places, go through the various combats, go through the various encounters and get all the materials they need first. So throw in those locked gates, and as a DM, you can go into your DM group and kind of create symbols to kind of represent where certain things might be. So I've got a symbol here that shows that this is a locked gate. Remember, this is just for you as a DM. You clearly will not be showing this when the battle actually takes place. But various icons, you can also, if you want, label where traps will be. I just use a T on a white circle to kind of show like, oh, this is where traps will be. And also, if I want to show that there might be where chests or a corpse that might have keys that unlock some of those doors, I'll label that too, okay? So let's go ahead and turn off those icons for now, and we'll kind of continue on with the access stuff, because access is going to be probably the majority of the stamps you're going to be putting on. So let's go back into access. Okay, and we'll go back in there. And there's obviously going to be that summoning circle that I was talking about. And there's going to be a couple of them, because there's going to be the main summoning circle where players go to in that puzzle chamber. And then it leads to each one of these kind of summoning circles here. And you can make a lot of different versions of this map with Resize. And we'll go over that shortly. But first, let's just go over all our access stuff first. So you have that summoning circle. Remember, summoning circles give you access to the isolated chamber. So it makes sense to make summoning circles a part of access. We're also going to throw down puzzles because the puzzles play a role in accessing the summoning circle. Those puzzles are going to also be in the access group. Okay, so as you know, a lot of things are going to be accessed. And I've just used these puzzle boxes. They're labeled puzzle boxes in the Gothic Horror. And what the players will end up doing is having to solve each one of these puzzles to unlock the box that will probably give them a gem or something that will allow the summoning circle to interact with, taking them to various chambers. Okay, you got to decide for yourself and do a little bit of planning on how to set up those puzzles. Maybe we'll even do a stream on how to make puzzles both visually and how to operate them. Okay, that'd be a fun little stream. So puzzles totally make sense in access. We'll also want to do traps. Now, you don't have to visually show your traps with a stamp, but you can put them down for now. Because you want some of your traps to be visible so that players can actually avoid them, while some traps are going to be hidden, right? So if they step on a panel, they'll fall down into something. So you want to have traps that are both hidden and both visually that the players can see, because you want players to be able to avoid certain traps, and some traps are maybe unavoidable or more difficult to detect. So for now, I'm going to put on visible traps that players can see, and that way they can avoid them. There's a couple trap options. All I did was just size up the trap so that it fits into that 5x5 square foot. And maybe combat takes place inside of this chamber. So if you're fighting with someone, maybe you want to kick them and they fall into it. So it's not just a trap for you and your players or for the players. It's also a trap that you can use to attack people, maybe your enemies or monsters. maybe there's a roper or a spider, and you kick them off into that pit and they fall into that pit. So that way you don't have to go through, multi exchanging, hack slash until they die. Instead, you do a nice critical roll or a nice roll, kick them right into that pit where they die. Okay, so traps are useful not just for you, not just to ensnare you, but can be used to ensnare your enemies. Okay, so super important to do that as well. Okay, so you'll see that I've added a bunch of traps and I put them right within the square so that way when a player lands on them, there's no confusion about, well, I'm half on the trap and half on a not trap space. So, hey, did I actually step on the trap? There'll be no confusion about it, okay? And remember, you don't have to make all your traps visible. Just a few of them have to be visible. You want some traps to be triggered, be visible for your players to avoid, while other traps far more difficult to detect. You want them to do some perception rolls, right, to find some of those more difficult traps. We're also going to want to add chests. Chests play a huge role in your dungeons, right? Chests might have that special item or armor that's going to be the critical part in defeating maybe the boss. So it's going to be a part of access, right? If you get that key or you get that maybe that important item that's going to help you to push forward. Maybe there's a key in it. So chests are absolutely fall into the category of access because they might have items that are necessary for you to continue forward to access other parts of the dungeon. So super ridiculously important to throw in chests in with the access part, not just the loot, but also chests that help you to progress further on. Hey, first time chatter, super glad that you're here. Evil mimic, nom 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 nom, gonna eat you up. Yes, throw down your chests if you want them to be a mimic to come and get you, right? So they're just like chests, crates and barrels fall into the same category. If you're like Zelda running around beating up pots, waiting for rupees, same thing with your crates and your barrels. Maybe there'll be some important things inside of the crates and barrels that you want to find, right? So crates and barrels are going to be super, super duper important when you're decorating your dungeon. Consider them a part of access because you can also use them as a weapon. You can throw them at an enemy. You can trip them with it. You can kick it. You can use a spell to levitate and hit them with it. So it's all part of that access, as well as things being inside of the crate that might be useful with progressing further into the dungeon. So crates and barrels fall into the same category as your chests, okay? There's also going to be some rope bridges that can be traps. And I'll show you how I kind of made these sections where it looks like there's like a chasm that you have to travel over. Because I just made the dungeon, the interior part with the add mode of the mask tool, you can just go ahead and take a color black because it's that same color as the background or the outside of the dungeon, and just set it to the FG layer, use that edgy brush, and then just kind of paint in a kind of gap, kind of like this, so that way it looks like there's a chasm there. And rope bridges are a great way to create tension. Maybe a battle is going to take place there. Maybe you want to kick your enemies off of the chasm. Maybe the bridge is a trap and it falls down. One of your players falls down to the chasm, takes you to another part of the dungeon. So rope bridges are, again, a part of access leading to other parts of the chamber. They can act as traps. They're great to interact with in encounters because, again, you can kick your enemy down the chasm. It creates a bottleneck. Maybe you have a tank-like character and maybe they're blocking the entrance, taking the damage while your other players are shooting projectiles at the monsters on the bridge or on the other side. So those rope bridges work great as kind of a bottleneck. Maybe you want to lure some of the monsters away and lure them towards that rope bridge so they can bottleneck and then attack those monsters. So rope bridges are really, really helpful. I'm also going to throw down kind of a corpse as well. You may say, well, how is a corp access? Well, if there's a set of keys or an item that's on their personage that allows you to go further into the dungeon, then bang, they're going to be accessed, right? So many things. Any stamp that is going to progress or allow access or restrict access to anywhere in the dungeon, loop that right into access. So if you start with that, then it's not so complex, right? If you start putting in all the access items into each chamber, you won't be confused on what do I add here and what do I not. So that's going to be super important. That last one is going to be rubble, and rubble's super important because it's going to block access to things. Notice that I've got some rubble right here, and that rubble is blocking access. Maybe a spell has to be used to get rid of it, or maybe you need to find some bucket or a shovel to shovel it out. Okay, so adding in that rubble is a great way to show that there's a collapse and it's restricting access to a certain place. I think there's another one I have right here as well. There's some rubble right here that kind of blocks access into the boss chamber. Okay, so now we've kind of covered all the stuff with access, okay? And there's a lot of different things that you could kind of do. So let's go in, once we've kind of put that together, let's go focus on the boss chamber. We've kind of put the puzzles together. We've put that, so let's go work on boss chamber. And the boss chamber is going to be a chamber that should be a little bit more unique than the other chambers, and there should be a lot more things to kind of interact with. And so I've put in these kind of boulders right here that are kind of take up an entire 5 square foot space. So your players can climb up it, jump off of it to do, you know, more damage, or maybe it will give more, maybe you have the boss over here and you want the arrows to do more damage or go farther away to do more further distance. Then these kind of elevation gives your players some interesting environment to deal with. Maybe you want to throw in a giant pit instead. A lot of things that you can do in a boss chamber. You want to throw in maybe some mega pit where maybe monsters are coming out of. Make sure that it's just to the grid. Okay, so you have this pit and maybe there's monsters coming out of it, as well as trying to fight these minions on top of a main boss. And then also these kind of tight space right here also creates that bottleneck. Maybe your monster is an extra size monster with a, you know, that extra large token, so they are limited space. So this would kind of allow players to fit right in here, while it would keep maybe a large token monster from kind of reaching access to get to you. So throwing in obstacles, things that you can interact with, maybe some rubble on the ground, maybe you want to throw the rocks, maybe this monster works by sound, so you want to throw a rock against the chamber, throw it somewhere, and so the monster will go that way. So throwing in stamps to interact with during combat is super helpful. It could be a log, it could be crates that you can jump over, it could be a pit, whatever it might be. You want to have an environment that's incredibly engaging for your players, because combat can get really boring when you don't have an environment or a kind of battle map that has some engagement for your players. It has to be more than just, I walk up to them / walk away and let the next person do it. Create various kind of environments that your players can engage with and be involved with, making the battle way more interesting and unique, okay? All right, now I want to go into my DM. Now, once you've kind of put together all that stuff, you want to also kind of label where your encounters are going to be, because you want to know what's going to be happening. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn this on right here. I've used these red paths to kind of show where the majority of combat, where encounters are going to take place. This is only for you, the Dungeon Master, for what you can see, okay? So those red areas are where most of the combat is going to take place. Obviously, the boss chamber. I've also got a well right there with some blood. So this is like an access point for maybe giant rodents of unusual size coming out of that well right there. That's why you kind of see some blood right there. That's why that area has been circled. And then you see that same concept with a bloody well right here. So I've also labeled this kind of area as a place where an encounter will take place. Maybe the players, when they first start out, they're walking along and they won't have any encounter until they get to this section right here. So there's a little opening right here for players to do some combat. So maybe the first the first encounter will take place right at that entrance, kind of preparing your players for what to expect. Throwing in an encounter right at the entrance or several spaces after the entrance kind of preps the players for what to encounter. You could maybe throw in some evil bats, ropers, a spider, maybe something that's not a very powerful monster or creature, so that way it's kind of easy, but at least you might have multiple of those running around, so that way your players know what to expect, okay? So throwing in a little bit of combat in the beginning kind of gives players an idea of what they're going to be dealing with. And remember, we had that rope bridge right here. Great place to have combat to do the bottlenecking, so we'll throw some combat in there. And of course, combat is not limited to these zones. This labeling I've done for myself as a DM, combat can be carried out anywhere in the dungeon. It's just that that's where the spawn is, or where the trap will be laid, or where the creatures will be. You can lure them anywhere you want in the dungeon towards the traps. You can lure them away from a location so that you can then kind of ditch them and then go back to an area. So lots of different kind of options there. And I've done the last one where combat will take place is another rope bridge right here, okay? But again, you can, any location on the map is gonna work, but I'm throwing them in specific locations, okay? Because, you know, you're right, there'll be patrols, but this is just to kind of give you an idea where the encounter will start, and then from there it will go anywhere on the map. So again, the red lines are not a restriction of where the combat's going to take place, but where it will start, and it will travel throughout the thing. And in fact, there'll be roaming patrols that might patrol a certain area, so watch out for that. And of course, it's always nice to draw enemies into traps, draw them away from a guarded item, an artifact, a chest. Maybe it's a stronger creature that you can't take alone, or your team isn't ready for, so you draw them away, get to that place where an artifact or a chest is that gives you the item that gives you the upper hand to defeat that. It's not about just walk up to hack slash. It's about using your intelligence, using the players working together as a team to find strategies to defeat the various monsters or bosses that you're going to be placing within that dungeon. Okay, so super important to be sure to think about where combat is going to take place, what's going to be the first combat, the very first encounter that your players are going to have. That first encounter is going to want to be easy, and the further they go into the dungeon, the further or more difficult combat will become. Or maybe they've gone through a series of simple battles, like you could say that there are maybe a series of simple battles that take place. They're very easy ones, like maybe a simple battle takes place here with just one creature that's easily killed, another one here, and another one here. These may be consecutive battles, but they're all easy monsters to defeat, right? Well, once you've defeated that, then you have a room with some rest, okay? That's why this is a puzzle room, right? Because you've gone through these 3 easy encounters here, now to give your players a rest and to put their mental faculties to use here and try to solve that puzzles. They've already gone through the combat. So whenever you put down combat areas, make sure there is an area that has one, rest, a place where they can heal, lick their wounds, figure out a strategy on where to move next, or if they need to discover and kind of explore a chamber looking for things. And then obviously you're going to need a reward. Okay, so the place of rest should obviously have a reward. You don't need to reward players for one simple or easy encounter. If they've gone through 3 easy encounters and then they go to a room or a chamber of rest, reward them for that. Okay, your players need to feel like their efforts is being rewarded. So after a couple easy combats or one difficult combat, the next chamber should have some kind of reward, whether it's a reward that gives you access to another part of the map, or if it's got a special weapon, or it's got some healing potions inside of a chest. Make sure that your players have that rest and that sense of reward, because players are going to divest from the combat, are going to divest from the dungeon and being interested when they're not being rewarded for their efforts. So be sure that when you do place your encounters, that the next chamber away from those encounters, you'll have a chamber where they can rest and feel, reap the fruits of their labor, reap some reward. Okay, so that's going to be super important. All right. Now, of course, after you've done all that, the last thing you'll do is you'll probably throw in details, and details are not complex. There's so many different things that you can throw in for details. You want to throw more rubble down. You want to throw in some papers that are flying around. There's all these different kind of things that work as details. I'm not going to put a lot of details in this dungeon because I want it to be reusable, and I'll show you how to do all that reusable part. Hey, first time chatter, Morning Glory Market. Super glad that you're here. Really glad that you enjoying the tool. Make sure to go ahead and join our Discord, okay, too, because we have an incredible community that's incredibly helpful, okay? So go check that out. All right, so let's go ahead and go into the last bits, which is going to be lighting. That'll be important when you go into your VTT because you want to have certain areas that'll be more lit up than others. Lighting is super important. It sets the atmosphere and it sets the kind of ambiance, right? Because to make something more scarier, you create the unknown. So if there are certain chambers that you want to be more terrifying, maybe there's difficult combat, you want to create this sense of anxiety in your players, then leaving some chambers without light sources and some chambers with light sources will create that ambiance, okay? So some of these isolated chambers where the summoning circles are, these have no lighting whatsoever, making it a little bit more kind of mortifying, right? Making it a little bit more scarier, unless your players are elves and they have kind of a night vision ability. But for the most part, you want to use lighting to show in certain areas that are more important than others. Okay, so if you want a sense of terror, you want a sense of unknown, you want this certain chamber to be scary, don't put any lights in it. Leave it purely dark. Don't put any light sources in it. And when it goes into the VTT, only your field of view will be able to show inside the chamber. That making it to where it's a little bit more scary. That's how you create tension, create fear inside of a chamber. Because making your players poop their pants just a little bit is, kind of fun. Okay, just a little bit, right? Okay, so you've added in those light sources, and just so you know, you don't have to use a torch or a sconce. Sometimes within underground chambers, you can have a hanging light. Like maybe there's a chandelier hanging, or there's a shaft at the top of the chamber where there's light coming in. All you have to do is just slap a light source or a light right on there, and that's it. And you don't have to worry about putting a torch. So notice that there are some torches here where there's a light source, and then some of these chambers right here, there's just a light source from a shaft above that goes down onto that puzzle box. So you don't have to have a light source. You can just put a light stamp somewhere if you want to show that there's some natural lighting come from the outside. That's up to you, okay? Once you've kind of put all that stuff together, you've gone through all the various process, you've put together the chambers, the various rooms, you've put down your encounters, you know where all the different keys and locks are, you know where the encounters are going to be, you've decorated that. You can kind of move on to filters. Filters are what are going to set the mood of your thing. So if you want maybe to have, let's go through the various filters here so we can kind of turn them off here. Let's go with the ones that I'm choosing for this one, and I'll show you some other filters that you can use, because you can make it look like it's a lava, make it look like it's evil greenish looking sewer, making it just look like a darkish kind of blue color, all these different things that you can do. So we'll start with first by adding a texture called old paper, which can be found in the parchment style. And old paper creates some extra artifacts, allowing the ground to look like it has a little bit more artifacts on it. Let me turn it off real quick so you can see what happens. See how cleaner it looks when I turn it off? But when I turn on old paper, it gives it that more grungier, underground, dirtier look to it, as you would expect from a dungeon like this, right? And then you also want to maybe turn on a vignette. A vignette will darken the corners of a dungeon, kind of giving it a sense of more darkness to it. Let me turn it off. See, when I turn it back on, you'll notice that there's a vignette that goes around it. That can be very, very helpful. You can also turn on that clarity filter to make sure that the things kind of pop out a little bit more. And then I'm going to throw down a doom and gloom filter as well to kind of give it this kind of darkish blue, maybe a little bit of greenish feel to it. But you can go through all the various types. You could use this corrupted essence that gives it a more greenish feel, a more bluish feel with winter. Maybe I want use cool warm to give it a more purplish feel to it, maybe faded. Okay, so you can use the various types of filters to change the overall theme of it, okay, which can be very, 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 very helpful. I'm going to stick with, I kind of like that corrupted essence, kind of gives it that greenish, creepy feel, and I like this doom and gloom as well, kind of gives it a nice kind of feel to it. So filters are going to be ridiculously important for kind of setting the mood or the atmosphere. Now, once you finish that, you know that when you're working on a campaign, you don't want to have to make 12 different dungeons, okay? Instead, you might want to just resize the map. So resizing is not complex, and it's extremely helpful because this dungeon can actually be multiple dungeons that you can use throughout your campaign. So if you go to that grid shape and you click resize from region, you can just say, well, there's maybe just a certain region of the dungeon that I like, for maybe I want to make a smaller dungeon. You could just click this right here and resize it, and what it will do is it will make only this section where the box is be that dungeon, right? Maybe I want this whole section right here just to be a dungeon right here, okay? Maybe I just want this to be a thieves fort later in the game. Then you can do that. Maybe I want this chamber to be maybe a cult hideout in a different part of the campaign. So resizing, using that resize feature, allows you to take the dungeon and break it up into multiple pieces, create a new map with it, and that way it has multiple uses. There's no need or time for you as a DM to say, well, I have to make these 12 dungeons for this campaign, but I don't want to make each individual dungeon. By just using the resize feature, you can take a section of the map, make it a new map, and then add in the appropriate stamps, texturing, and details to make it conform to whatever the theme or setting that you want that dungeon to be. So the resize feature is going to be an absolute godsend for you when you are making a dungeon, okay? All right, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on this map, by the way, will be available to clone when this video has been uploaded into YouTube. I'll make sure to put this map in the video description so that you can clone and use it for yourself and change things as you see fit. It's entirely up to you. I don't mind you using it for your own personal use. Okay, so as always, process is really the key. Okay, so I'll quickly review. You just start with picking a setting. That's going to be whatever it might be, a sewer, a cult, underground structure, whatever it might be. Lots of different choices that you can choose from, right? Once you've chosen the setting or the theme, you want to choose the scale, okay? And like I said, 5 by 5 square feet. I've got that grid on, and of course that grid is going to be helpful for setting the scale of both stamps and setting the size, the width and length of rooms, okay? So you got to throw that down. Then you're going to look at dungeon shapes. You'll start with your entrance, progressing into other chambers. And then you'll want to lead to your boss chamber and, of course, a horde chamber or a treasure chamber. Those are going to be the most important chambers. Everything else can be auxiliary or can be other chambers that are not nearly as important, but you got to have maybe some kind of puzzle chamber, or you can scatter puzzles throughout the entire dungeon. That's fine too. You got to have that boss battle, and you got to have the place where your treasure or the loot is going to be after you defeated that boss battle. Once you've made the dungeon, you put the shapes together, you can either use the mask tool with the mask effects to make your dungeon, or you can just use walls. Remember, I can turn off these walls right here, and you'll notice that this still works as a dungeon even if there's no walls on it, because I've used the mask effects to create the wall effect. Me, personally, I like the walls. but you don't have to use them. It depends on your machine and how much time you have. So you're going to pretty much brick or frame all the chambers. After you've done that, you're going to want to focus on access. And remember the various things that are in access. It's any stamp that you're going to put down in a chamber that's going to restrict or allow access to something else. And there's so many different things that fit into that category, okay? From traps to puzzles to summoning circles, locked gates, rope bridges, rubble, crates, barrels, chests, you name it. So if you ever get confused on where to start, what to populate your dungeon with, start with access. And really you can start with the entrance, exit, and then move from there. If you start by making your dungeon shapes with the entrance and moving towards the horde chamber or the treasure chamber, you should do it the exact same way with decorating each chamber with stamps. Start with all the access and then move that way, okay? After you've done access, you're going to want to make sure that you put down where all your for you as a DM, you're going to want to put down where encounters are going to take place, so that way you'll know where the encounters will be. You need to know where the traps and the puzzles are, if there's transportation circles, or whatever kind of other types of labels you want to put down for you as a DM. Remember, the DM, your players won't see those things. Only you will see them. But it's nice to mark areas and certain things for yourself so that you don't get confused on where things go. After you've done all the markings and you've finished everything up, you want to throw down your light sources. You're going to want to throw down filters so that way you can kind of create some ambiance. And then once you've done that, save it and then start resizing certain sections of that so that way you could have multiple dungeons in your campaign. That's why it's good to start with a mega dungeon like this when you're doing it. And that way, because if you made a small dungeon with just 3 chambers, its reusability is not as high because you can't go through different ones. So make a large dungeon first. It'll take a little bit longer, but it has a total reusable value. Okay? All right. Well, hey, that is it for the stream. Next week, we're going to be showing you how to create elven cities. I got a really cool design and I'm super excited about that. So that's going to be cool. Hey, first time chatter, Bob Sage. Glad that you are here. Glad that you watch these videos. We've got so many more videos to come. Don't forget to join the Discord and to go to stream requests. If there's certain things that you want us to make or to do a tutorial about, let us know, because we're all ears. We listen to our users, okay? All right, so next week, how to make elven cities. And I was thinking that we would, every single week, we would make at least one type of city, because cities are super popular. So, you know, maybe, or not every single week, but every single month, we'd have one city stream. So next month, we'll do another city stream. Awesome. Hey, thanks everybody. Please stay safe and healthy. I will see you all next week. Merry map making. Auf Wiedersehen, everybody. Love you all very much. Take it easy, okay?